Okay guys, welcome back to another episode of Rotten Reviews. On this episode I take a look at the 2011 film Sucker Punch. It has a 22% on the tomato meter and a 47% on the audience score. Lots of people consider this rotten. It is rotten on Rotten Tomatoes. It is bad-mouthed all over the internet. However, I'm going to take the contrary opinion on this one and say that this film doesn't exactly deserve to be rotten. It's very much misunderstood. It is perhaps due to its marketing, which was very misleading. It was marketed as a sci-fi action fantasy featuring hot girls having these cyberpunk sci-fi battles. Very much something that a teenager or a young adult sci-fi fan, fantasy fan would go to watch, particularly a male. However, that's not exactly what this film is. In fact, it's not even what this film is. It's very much misunderstood. In fact, Sucker Punch is more of a study in how you can go into your own fantasies, how you can use fantasy to escape life's problems, how characters and people in the real world often do escape into their fantasy worlds as a self-preservation mechanism. This film is about that in its entirety. It's just that the visuals overpower everything else, and certainly the marketing probably was deliberately pumped up to get it as a sci-fi action appeal as far as getting people into the audience to pay their money and get their butts into the seats. Now, if you were misled into going to see this in the theater, that this was some kind of great sci-fi action thing, some kind of superhero film, then you are probably rightfully angry that that's not exactly what you got. Again, part of that misleading superhero genre thing would be that Zack Snyder is actually the director of this, and Zack Snyder, of course, is known for superhero movies. Some good, some bad, but let's not get off on that tangent. This movie actually doesn't deserve to be rotten. It features a main character by the name of Baby Doll, played by Emily Brown, who, in very short terms, she kills her sister in an attempt to kill her abusive dad. This is all shown in a very cinematic fashion at the beginning of the movie, and after she has killed her sister by accident, it kind of puts her in a mental state, enabling her abusive father to have her committed into an insane asylum of some type. I believe it is set in Vermont, certainly somewhere around there. The setting isn't really important. This is basically a story within a story, or a fantasy within a fantasy that the main character of Baby Doll escapes into. Now, at the end of this film, it's not really a good or a bad ending. It's not really a happy ending. It's not really a sad ending. It's a little bit up to interpretation. On one hand, it's a happy ending in that Emily Brown's Baby Doll character has, in a way, sort of in a third-person way, escaped from the asylum. She has used a disassociative state of her mind, a character she has created in her mind, and has fantasized that that character has escaped the asylum, and it's kind of a happy ending in that regard. But now when we get into the rage that fanboys of actual superhero movies have over this film, the reason why they rate it so low is because they didn't get their superhero film. They got a lot of sequences that belonged in a superhero movie, but they were all fantasy sequences inside Baby Doll's character, inside her mind. And at the end of the movie, she gets a lobotomy, and the lobotomy sort of sets her free. It's a very strange ending. You can see a positive or a negative ending into it. Let's take a look at the audience reviews, and you're going to see why people really misunderstand this. They either got it or they didn't. Now, personally, I think this wasn't, a blockbuster. It wasn't, even as a psychological study of fantasy, it wasn't the greatest thing ever, but I don't think it deserves to be rotten. I would give this perhaps a 2.5 stars, coming close to 3. It has some some very, very inventive cinematography. It's fantastic in that regard. It has some flaws, but I would say 2.5 stars, not quite reaching 3. But let's take a look at the first audience review. And we have one from actually 16 hours ago, which would put this in November of 2019 at the time of this Rotten review. 4 stars. This is another movie I really enjoy that most people, it seems, don't. There's good action with women that kick butt, and I enjoy the storyline as well. This is just a fun movie with good CGI and 5 women who are strong and tough, even if it is only in one's imagination. Well, exactly. 4 stars, no. 2.5 stars. This is set inside the main character's imagination. It has other characters. There are 5 or 6 characters. There's like a cadre of female action heroes who aren't actually action heroes. They are women who are held in an insane asylum. Now there's another layer of escape to this, in which the main character imagines that the insane asylum is actually some sort of high-end underground bordello for arms dealers and drug traffickers and the criminal underworld, and that they are held prisoner in there. And that's like a layer of fantasy underneath the insane asylum. And then there is another layer of fantasy under that, featuring the action sequences, steampunk sci-fi action sequences, in which the main character is plotting to gather the materials needed to escape her plight. It's kind of a story layered inside of another story, a Russian nesting doll of stories, so to speak, but it only goes 3 layers deep. So when I say Russian nesting doll, don't assume that there are like 5 or 6 flashbacks inside flashbacks here or anything that ridiculous like some other films have tried to do. But this is basically a fantasy within a fantasy, and the ending is also a little ambiguous, so you don't know if you've escaped all of it in the fantasy or you've escaped only one of these fantasies, or perhaps you've only escaped, the surface of the fantasy world. But clearly at the end of this movie, you have not escaped the ultimate reality that this film starts with. The character does end up lobotomized at the end, so there is actually no escape from that. And that may be another thing that turns off people looking for a true ending, and that they don't get a 100% positive ending. It's up to your interpretation on that. Let's continue on. 5 stars, November 17th, 2019. If your eyes are opened, you can see the profundness or profoundness behind the visuals and storytelling beyond the ordinary. I rate the Sucker Punch movie as a 5 out of 5. I would say no, but yes, the visuals are fantastic. For 2011 CGI, it holds up very well in 2019. I saw like 10 minutes of this in 2011 when this came out on DVD. I didn't have time to pay attention to it, so I didn't have a chance to just sit down and focus on it. Now, seeing this recently, as of 3 or 4 days ago in 2019, I can say the CGI holds up very well. There's nothing off-putting in here. The only flaw I saw in the action fantasy CGI part of this, the fantasy sequences, some of them are a little bit too long. They could be shaved down a minute or two. And there's, in particular, a fantasy sequence that takes place on a train, in which the characters in the fantasy are fighting against sort of like cybernetic robots, kind of like robots that remind me a little bit of the ones in I, Robot with Will Smith. They're fighting those on a train, and that's a little bit boring and drawn out too long. Otherwise, there are also rip-offs of, samurais with machine guns, and there's a sequence, straight up out of a Tolkien movie, in which there's a dragon in a castle and whatnot. That's just a little bit long, but not too long. The train sequence is certainly too long, but these work. They hold up very well. You don't actually check your watch. It's not that bad, but it does seem a little bit stretched out in relation to what you got as far as characters being fleshed out and the relationships between each other being fleshed out. There really are only 2 characters that matter in this, and that's the main character of Baby Doll, that the actual first character you see that starts the story. Then the actual other character which is relevant is called Sweet Pea, played by Abby Cornish. I say these are the only 2 characters that are really integral to the story, because Baby Doll is the girl that's admitted to the asylum, and Sweet Pea is actually her dissociative character that she moves into, in effect, escaping the asylum through her fantasy character. These characters are integral to everything that happens. The other characters, Amber, for example, and Blondie, they are there for the action sequences, but they aren't necessary to what happens in the resolution of this story. I say it's just basically Sweet Pea and Baby Doll that you can argue which one of them's the main character. It's like Baby Doll is the main character, but then when we reach the end of the film, Sweet Pea is now the main character. She's the one who has escaped. She is the almost like a split personality character, a dissociative character that has actually escaped, whereas Baby Doll is still back in the asylum and has been lobotomized. Yeah, it's a lot for me to probably explain. I don't know if I've done it justice to explain it. It's kind of confusing to hear me talk about it probably. But just know there are two main characters. The others aren't as important. There are other notable actors in this, like Oscar Isaac, for example. There are other characters that play roles that could have been played by different people. Nobody does a really bad acting job in this. No one does a really outstanding job in this. Largely, they're replaceable characters because they're not deep enough or complex enough to be to need, a special actor for each role. Let's just say that this is more of a it's a fantasy, escape into fantasy. It literally is an escape into fantasy by the main character. Yeah, I'm going on this a little bit too much, I think, but let's get more into some audience reviews. We have a half-star review. I thought this was a movie about Zack Snyder getting suckered punched. Happy Purim, everyone. Yeah, that's probably from somebody that saw Zack Snyder some kind of superhero movie in the marketing and thought this was going to be another Man of Steel. And yeah, it's not. It's not a superhero movie. It's not a DC Comics movie. It's got some crazy stuff in it that is even too crazy for the average superhero movie, but it's still fascinating to watch. It's still a visual feast. Again, it's not a superhero movie, so the superhero just fanboys that got suckered into this, they're very angry, and I understand why they're very angry. If they paid money for it, certainly. If they had just seen this on HBO or something, then they're probably not as salty about it, but it is not a superhero comic book movie. 4.5 stars. While the fantasy fight scenes drug out a bit longer than I'd have liked, and there was a little too much philosophy being pushed in the last few minutes, I was surprised by how well constructed the movie was. A lot of people seem to have found issue with the lack of development for Baby Doll, or get hyper-focused on how there's a missed opportunity on whatever we're calling a strong female character these days. I would argue that the character was developed as well as you could need. Yeah, the character was developed enough for what the story needed. This wasn't a complex character study. There was enough here to make the whole thing work, in my opinion. That's why I don't think this deserves to be in rotten territory. Now, I think as far as, having a bunch of sexy women in the fight scenes, and even when they're not in the fantasy world fighting as action heroes, they are in the, the underground bordello where they're held against their will, and they're dressed very sexy here too. But you see, this is like something that may rub the woke crowd the wrong way, having these women portrayed, completely in sexy ways most all of the time. That's not what the movie is going for. It's not trying to make all the girls helpless, damsels in distress, and victims of sexual abuse. That's not what the film is trying to do here. The film is just trying to show you how a fantasy world is something that the main character wants to escape into, and part of the fantasy for a woman as well as a man is sex appeal. It just is. But yes, the woke crowd is going to be very disturbed about the fact that in the fantasy scenes in particular, you have this heroine and several others of her comrades. They're running around, like, for example, in a fantasy setting of World War I, a steampunkish type of World War I, and they are dispatching the bad guy guys with samurai swords and machine guns while they're dressed up in sexy outfits. It is what it is, and if your sensibilities are just so far gone that this offends you, then you shouldn't be watching comic book movies, fantasy movies of any type. Just stick to the docudramas, because that's probably more your cup of tea. So let's move on. Wow, 5 stars. Sucker Punch is a brilliant movie. It is not what it seems. Mild spoilers. The storyline is perfectly cover under the first-person narrative, which is the main character point of view, Dollface, well, Baby Doll, who imagines a world in which she feels empowered enough to gain control of her actions and the outcomes. The story begins with Baby Doll being sent to an asylum by her stepfather, who clearly abuses her. It is implied that it's sexual abuse, and by the age difference, her innocent demeanor. Okay, yeah, the movie, there's not any dialogue in the beginning of the movie. It's very visual. It's incredibly well done visually. It's all done by just the visual sequence, and you still know exactly what's going on. This Baby Doll character, she is abused by her stepdad. I guess it's her stepdad. It doesn't really specify. The stepdad kills the mom. It's not shown how, but it's implied he killed her. Baby Doll witnessed it. She found a gun and tried to kill her stepdad and inadvertently killed her sister instead, and then she's sent to the insane asylum. All of this is carried out completely in a visual way. The cinematography, the way it's done, is fantastic. I mean, it had me hooked from the beginning, and I was impressed that the film was able to say so much just visually without dialogue or anything. It's just visual, and it's done perfectly, and I'll have to say that it's almost disappointing to me that Zack Snyder has other movies like comic book movies where he fails to do this. Now, I'm not saying he's the sole person responsible for how well this visual style came across in Sucker Punch, but if he had done this in Man of Steel, for example, or I believe Batman v Superman, if he had done this in other actual comic book movies, he would be seen as a genius. But he uses this style of storytelling, this visual ingenuity to get the point across so well in Sucker Punch, and yet Sucker Punch just isn't culturally a thing. Man of Steel is a big superhero film. It was at the time. It still kind of is for Superman fanboys. They like to argue about it, and yet if Snyder had just used this visual ingenuity in Man of Steel would be hailed as like a 4-star movie, but of course it's not. That's not what happened, and that's very disappointing to me that somebody like Zack Snyder could make this and show us what he's capable of, and then go on to make forgettable DC comic superhero movies that, are just have divided the fanboys over whether they're even good. It's just sad, and it's disappointing to me, because Sucker Punch shows me that Zack Snyder is really a genius in some ways. I don't want to give him too much credit, but this film does work visually. It does what it's supposed to do. The only corny stuff is in which a fantasy character played by, I believe it is, I can't remember his name. There's a fantasy character in this that shows up to give advice to the girls when they're about to have their fantasy action missions. And he kind of gives them some corny, cliched type of, Zen master type of advice. It's supposed to be corny and cliched, which what I'm trying to say is that the lines that come out corny and cliched in this movie are actually deliberately supposed to come out like that, and it's obvious. And that's why I say it doesn't deserve to be rotten, because if you say this has corny dialogue, well, that corny dialogue was supposed to be corny dialogue. You just didn't get that. So again, I don't think this is rotten in any regard. Let's move on before I get too sidetracked here. Half a star. I got deceived by the trailer on this one. This movie sucked. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. People got deceived by the trailer. They thought they were getting a steampunk sci-fi action thing, comic book type movie. That's not really what this is. That's just the visual fantasy that's inside of this movie, not the main point of it. 1.5 stars. Flat, scantily clad female characters getting lost in their action-adventure fantasies. Yep, pass. Well, it's more than that. It's a little bit deeper than that. This is not deep enough to be like, Oscar-winning character, Oscar Academy Award-winning character study or anything, but this is not as flat as just having sexy, scantily clad girls just, get lost in their fantasies. There's more to it than that, but not a whole lot more. So I say 2.5 stars, not 1.5 stars. That's not fair. 4 stars. I feel guilty liking it, but I liked it anyway. Love the weirdness. Yeah, I don't feel guilty. A lot of people like it, and they just don't make their voices heard. The people that are most motivated to talk about this are the ones that are just pissed off about it because they thought this was a comic book movie. 5 stars. If you're an LGBT plus girl, this movie owns, which is to say this movie owns, and that if you don't think it owns, maybe the movie wasn't made for you and you shouldn't judge it. I'm not LGBT plus in any regard, but I still found this movie not rotten at all. I enjoyed it for what it was. 5 stars. Love this movie. I can't believe it has such low ratings. Well, I can believe it has low ratings because I understand that there was so much over-the-top good cinematographic comic book type action in this that even if you would cut the trailer to not show much of that, I'm sorry, that's what people would have expected because there's just that visual style in this is just so over the top. It's unavoidable. Even deliberately trying not to mismarket this, you would have mismarketed this. 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it. It's not for everyone, but if you were looking for a fun and over-the-top action movie, you will enjoy this. It has some dark elements too. I have no idea how they managed to get this rated a 12A, though. I wouldn't recommend this for children. Well, I'm not familiar with 12A. That must be something outside the U.S. This is PG-13 in the US. It feels like it almost wants to be R-rated, and I think if it had been R-rated, this would have worked better in some regards. But then again, I don't know if it's R-rated. You cut down the audience, and I think they wanted to get the teenage crowd into this, and you couldn't do that with an R rating. But it would have worked better, I think. It would have been more solid with an R rating. 2 stars. Very good visuals. If you look away for a minute, you are going to be kind of lost. Pandering is a good word for it. Well, yeah, I would say you have to keep your attention on this or you won't understand because you've got a fantasy inside another fantasy, and if you're not paying real close attention at the very beginning of this film, then you're going to be a little bit disjointed on how it ends exactly. So yeah, you can't really just like have this on in the background and understand what the hell's going on, or you won't get it at all. 2 stars. No, it's almost 3. I'd give it 2.5. Pandering. No. Maybe in the fact that they marketed this as a certain type of thing in the trailer, then yes, that would be pandering. 1.5 stars. I've always said that despite the issues I have with Zack Snyder's storytelling, he is great at capturing intense and striking visuals. That's what stands out as most impressive in Sucker Punch. It looks remarkable in many scenes and has a visual style that I don't see all that often. Of course, a significant amount of the credit for these visuals needs to go to Larry Fong, who is Snyder's cinematographer, so maybe Snyder isn't responsible for any of this good stuff. Yeah, that's what I was asking earlier. Maybe if this Larry Fong is largely responsible for the visuals, then that would explain why Snyder doesn't seem to have this same genius level of visual in his straight-up comic book movies. In my opinion, he should get Larry Fong and bring him along for any further comic book movies because, again, I'll say it, Man of Steel, I'm just not a fan, sorry, and I'm a comic fan. 5 stars. Maybe it's because I'm a huge fan of Emily Browning, but this movie is without a doubt my guilty pleasure, LOL. I don't recall seeing Emily Browning in anything. I'm sure I have, but she's just forgettable to me. Her baby doll character is actually more memorable to me than her as an actress. I don't know if that's good or bad. 5 stars, no. This is 2.5 stars, definitely, not 5 stars. 3.5 stars. It wasn't the greatest movie ever, but I liked it. I can agree with that, but not quite 3.5 stars. 4 stars. The beginning and ending were stupid and didn't tell a great story, but everything in the middle was kind of amazing. Even without the narrative holding together, they managed to string together compelling characters, compelling enough, and if you know enough abused kids, some of them feel familiar already, and creative, unique, and kick-ass action sequences and settings that make everything in the middle worth watching. Plus, the soundtrack is worth listening to all on its own. I'll say for me, the soundtrack did work, although it didn't fit with the settings, but it worked overall. It wasn't too jarring, but It didn't work considering that the actual real setting, the anchor setting of this is a 1950s asylum. The stuff didn't exist in the 1950s. Wireless headsets didn't exist in the 1950s. So that was a little bit odd. I think if the wireless headset stuff had been removed and the music had been a little less techno, a little less modern, it would have worked better because it just clashed a little too hard with that foundational 1950s setting that was, the supposedly the real part that was going on in the film. That was the only part that didn't work for me. Otherwise, yeah, the choice of music wasn't bad. I would say that this is a person that wrote this 4-star review that wanted a comic book movie but wasn't offended when they found out it wasn't one. Again, yeah, the characters, the fact that they're abused, I don't know if that actually works for me. I think it's a little too shallow to go too deeply into that. I think if you just see this as somebody that manages to escape in their own way, a situation that's really an impossible, no way to escape situation, then it works on that level. But if you're trying to find some deeper meaning about abused kids and childhood abuse and stuff, nah, you're not going to find that in this. But it's 2.5 stars. 1 star, couldn't make it through this abomination. Hot, barely clothed women used to compensate for a lack of any substance. It's more than that, but you're not paying attention. 4 stars. Fine film, really enjoyable. People usually have a tendency to criticize films that are different from what they are used to or expect to. No worse than any Marvel film of the last decade. Wrong. I would say again 2.5 stars, and it is worse than several Marvel movies because several of the Marvel movies not only do they manage to entertain you completely, but they also hold together narratively, plot-wise. This one, it entertains you, yes, but it doesn't completely, it's a little bit too jarring in some regards, and it doesn't hold everybody together. Yes, I found it enjoyable. I watched the whole thing, but a lot of people, they couldn't make it all the way through, so no, no, no. I disagree. There are several Marvel movies better than this. I don't know why you're even counting this with Marvel movies, because this is not a comic book movie. That's your a fundamental mistake there, is just comparing this to a comic book movie. This is just not. Just put aside what you thought when you watched the trailer. This is not a comic book movie. 0.5 star. This is the worst movie I've ever seen, for sure. I am still angry about the fact that I spent money on this movie to see it, and I feel sick when I think about the time I lost in watching it. It cannot recommend this movie. Yeah, you're a comic book movie fan. You expected that. You got tricked into it. I understand the hate. 5 stars. I disagree about there being no plot. The plot is there. It's just you have to read between the lines. For most people, they just want a film to entertain them. But I myself find entertainment in putting the story together myself. Other movies are just mind-numbing, and unless it's a series, you can't watch them again and again. I watched this roughly 20 times for the for the first 2-3 weeks my dad had borrowed it. Getting to the point, the movie isn't for people who don't want to think about it. Well, wow, 20 times you're really a fan. I don't know why you needed it 20 times. But yes, this does have something to offer for people that want to kind of find clues, put the clues together, and get some meaning that they're missing. It has that a little bit, but I think if you don't get it by like the 3rd or 4th time, you should stop. 20 is, it's not deep enough to require 20 times, but there are clues and ingenious things hidden in this that you'll see on the 2nd or 3rd time. But wow, yeah, if you can't get it on the 3rd time, you're not going to get it, in my opinion. 4 stars. Zack Snyder has a hit or miss track record as of late, with Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice performing below the hopes of Warner Brothers. However, he was also the visionary director behind 300 and Watchmen, 2 groundbreaking films that were ahead of their time. When he released his next live-action film, Sucker Punch, I was more than ready to jump on board. Little did I know how much I would actually enjoy it. The film was critically panned and failed at the box office, though. Yeah, I largely agree with this. He's done movies that are different, and he's done them well, and he's missed on Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, certainly, at least in my opinion and a lot of other people's opinions. Yeah, The Watchmen, yeah, I enjoyed that, even though I knew nothing about the comic book source material. I enjoyed Zack Snyder's Watchmen movie for what it was. It was different enough to keep me entertained. Now, the problem with this is it was panned critically and it was a box office flop because when people went in to see this, like I said, they expected a superhero movie, perhaps maybe as weird as The Watchmen, but certainly a superhero movie, and they didn't get that, and they felt like offended and misled and tricked into seeing it, and they told their friends, and consequently the movie bombed at the theater. But it didn't bomb because it's rotten or that it deserves to be rotten. This is an entertaining film, certainly. 4.5 stars. Sucker Punch evolves the badass in every one of us. It is such a thrilling experience, a very strange movie indeed, but that is what gives it so much flavor. The cast tops it off. We are spoiled with the performances of Emily Browning, Vanessa Hudgens, Jenna Malone, Jamie Chung, Carla Gugino, and many more. Zack Snyder presents to us warriors, girl power, strong women, sexuality, and brutality. It definitely makes for an extraordinary movie packed with action. I'll largely agree with that, but it doesn't rise to 4.5 stars. This is solid 2.5 stars. Let's be honest with ourselves. 4.5 stars again. I absolutely loved this movie. 4 stars. I really liked this movie. The music is great. 1 star. I felt like I was watching an adult film without the payoff and even less of a storyline. Well, okay, I will agree on one thing. It would have worked better for me if it was an R-rated movie because, yes, it seems like it's not giving us what it's kind of wanting to give us, and yeah, that's because it's PG-13. Yes, it would have worked better as an R-rated movie, but then again, it would have probably had even a smaller draw at the box office. That's my guess. So you're kind of stuck between a lot of the stuff with the ratings. When you cross from PG-13 into R-rated, you're really walking a fine line on a lot of movies. It's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So that's why some movies do have like a PG-13 cut, an R-rated cut, or maybe even a non-rated cut. This might have benefited from a non-rated cut, but then again, you'd have to kind of wonder if it would make up for that in video. In video sales, it could have made up for its loss at the box office by having a non-rated video version. I don't know on the on the numbers on that. I just know that a lot of these films where they're not clearly in one genre, they're not clearly traditional in any one genre sense, you're walking a fine line between PG-13 and R. You're kind of like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's just a hard call for anybody to make as to which way to go. 0.5 star. Don't let the cool poster and trailer fool you. This is utter garbage. Yeah, don't be misled that this is a comic book movie. It's not. 5 stars. Haunting story inside of multi-dimensional universes. This is not a multi-dimensional universe. It's simply a fantasy inside a fantasy, like a double-layered fantasy. No multi-dimensional stuff going on here. Not comic book stuff. It's not The Watchmen. It's not, it's not, what is it? Now it escapes me. The movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, where there's, like you have dreams within dreams. Inception. It's not Inception. It kind of has a shade of that, but this is completely fantasy. It's not Inception or anything like that. 5 stars. Excellent. My all-time favorite movie. I hope they make another one to continue on with the story. Seems like they did leave it open for one more movie. Can't wait. No, I disagree. I don't think this was meant to be a sequel, or there ever will be. This is a one-off. It's kind of like the Watchmen movie, the same thing. It wasn't intended to be a start a franchise either. It's just a one-off. 5 stars. Poignant and full of metaphorical depth. A commentary on what has historically been done to young women deemed dangerous by society. This movie saves us. I don't know if I read all that into it at all. It doesn't have anything about talking about society and young women in this. This is simply how somebody escapes into a fantasy world and uses what would be termed like dissociative personality disorder as a means of escape and to have a happy ending where there is no happy ending. So let's not read too much into that. I disagree. 5 stars. We really like this movie. Great effects and somewhat of a twisted plot that makes you think. The plot, it does make you think. It does kind of beg to be watched more than once. But again, don't put yourself through this more than 2 times or 3 times to think you're going to get more out of it. if you don't get it the second time, I say don't do it again to yourself. Don't hurt yourself. 3 stars, December of 2018. Well, the surreal ride to nowhere, but hey, tons of nearly naked girls, so who cares? They're not nearly naked. It's not all that. This is straight up. It almost goes PG. It's not even PG-13. I guess PG-13 because there's some violence, like people like getting punched and whatnot, right? But there's no blood and gore, and there's no even side boob or anything like that in here. Believe me, they're not nearly naked at all. I mean, they're no nearly naked than girls walking around in real life in some other outfit. Sorry. So don't exaggerate it. Half a star, unwatchable, vaudeville, sci-fi, action, drama, musical, all mixed up in a dirty plastic bucket. Should be flushed, not consumed. I don't agree with that, but I will say it kind of is a little disappointing that the main character, she dazzles people with her dance performance, and during her dance performance, her mind wanders off to this sci-fi action fantasy world where she's a superhero. It is kind of a little bit disappointing that you never do see her dance at all. It's all completely left up to your imagination that her dance has thrilled everybody, and I think that's that made the movie easier to do, but it's kind of a cheap way out too. So I'll agree with that. But half a star. No, this is 2.5 stars. It's worth watching one time. 4 stars. F-type of interested. Buck your tongue and twist. I don't know what they're talking about there. 1.5 star. Sucker Punch is a mess of a movie that is best described as a bad music video mixed with a video game with bad graphics, while the fantasy sequences come off straight up as epic video game battle sequences. That's what they're supposed to come across as. They overpower a lot of the rest of the film, yes. But yes, that's accurate. You will find a lot of video game action cinematography, but it's done very well. Trust me on that one. 5 stars. Still by far my favorite movie of all time. It's not all that. Half a star. The thin, confusing plot seems to be an excuse to parade girls in sleazy outfits in between sequences from computer games. Will appeal to lonely male geeks. You weren't really paying attention. The reviewer wasn't really paying attention to what was actually going on. Probably they had this on in the background most of the time, or their attention was elsewhere, because no, it's not that shallow. I'm sorry. 3 stars. The metaphor works, but the execution is lacking. Okay, I could agree with that. The metaphors works, yes. The story works. You know what's happening. The execution, it could have been better. It's not perfect by any means. That's why I say 2.5 stars. This reviewer's giving it 3. I don't think it's quite 3. I think it's 2.5, but it's worth watching one time. Yeah, execution could have been better. 1.5 stars. Sucker Punch 2011. 1.5 out of 5 stars. Zack Snyder directs this empty, hot mess. All style, no substance. Was this movie trying to say something? Was it trying to be clever and artsy? Who knows? Not me. A young woman finds herself in a mental institution and all kinds of escapism ensues. What kind of escapism, you ask? Cartoon caricatures of real or maybe imagined people, war, mission, quest, adventures, magical seduction, dancing that we don't get to see, clockwork, Nazi zombies. Yeah, that's all basically true in there. That whole paragraph there I just read is basically, I can't really disagree with that. But then again, it's not, if it's not your cup of tea, it's not. I say 2.5 stars. 5 stars. This movie is better than Sex, kinda. No, I'm sorry on that one, no. Maybe if you're 8, your imagination of sex, maybe. 4.5 stars. I think a lot of people aren't going to get the levels of psychological coping a la Calvin and Hobbes meets Wizard of Oz here. Elegant and beautifully delivered. Well, I'll agree with all that. If you get those references, that's true, but not 4.5 stars. I'm sorry, it's 2.5 stars. The execution could have been better. A lot of Zack Snyder's other movies, they're also no more than 2.5 stars. I'm sorry, but they are. That's just Zack Snyder in my opinion. I'm not a super fanboy of his. So here we have it, 22% on the tomato meter, 47% on the audience score. I think it deserves 60% on the audience score, just enough to bring it out of rotten, because this isn't rotten. It's the victim of misleading advertising, misleading marketing. And, even if it wasn't deliberately misleading in the advertising and the marketing, it probably would have done that anyway, because the visual style and the fantasy sequences are just too overpowering over the rest of it. So you would get people upset no matter what. And so I'm going to leave it at that and see you on the next episode of Rotten Reviews.